Cowboys of the Frontier. Spanish horses and cattle. Cowboys needed two things to do their jobs: horses and cattle. But at the beginning of America's history, there were neither. It wasn't until Spanish soldiers brought them on their travels from Mexico many years ago that the stage was set for cowboys. At first, the Spanish brought just a few horses, but soon they brought many more. The horses that the Spanish brought were war horses, healthy and strong, bred for hardship of combat. Sometimes the horses ran away. Native Americans also took horses from the Spanish. Eventually, these horses banded together into wild herds that roamed the plains. People called the wild horses mustangs. They were strong and hard-working, and they didn't need much food or water to live in the harsh American frontier. This made mustangs useful to cowboys. Cowboys also used quarter horses. These were a different type of horse, a combination of English and Spanish breeds. Quarter horses had strength and balance and could run fast for short distances. The Spanish also introduced cattle to America. These cattle were perfect for America's climate. They lived easily in dry areas and tolerated the brutal cold of winter and the extreme heat of summer. They were big cattle, wild and bad-tempered, and able to defend themselves against predators. Their big horns helped them fight. The tips of the horns could be more than 6 feet apart. Because of their horns, they became known as longhorn cattle. After the Civil War, people back east needed beef. The United States government also needed meat to feed Native Americans. The longhorns' meat was tough, but there were a lot of them in Texas. Cattlemen hired cowboys to move longhorn herds north. In 35 years, cowboys moved 10 million longhorns from Texas to Missouri, Kansas, and Colorado. Standing the gaff. Cowboys thought of themselves as more than simple farmhands. Farmhands slopped pigs, planted crops, and milked cows. But few farmhands worked with steer that could weigh as much as 1,000 pounds. Cowboys worked with big steer, sometimes herding them for hundreds of miles. Cowboys worked hard. In other words, they stood the gaff. Many cowboys were Texans. A large number of them had fought for the South in the Civil War. A few fought for the North as well. Some cowboys were sons of English nobles and were college educated. Some were outlaws. Some were preachers' sons. Some were former slaves, and some had owned slaves. Most were between 18 and 28 years old. About 1 out of every 3 cowboys was either Hispanic or African American. Many cowboys used nicknames. Edward C. Abbott had the nickname Teddy Blue. Nat Love claimed he was Deadwood Dick. Mesquite Bill, Wyoming Pete, and Lonesome Jensen were other cowboy nicknames. Whatever their name was on the trail, cowboys worked hard and slept little. In good weather and with a good-tempered herd, they could sleep from after supper until it was time for their night watch shift. In bad weather and with a bad-tempered herd, they might not get any sleep at all. To stay awake, sometimes they rubbed tobacco juice in their eyes. They drove the herd for 3 to 4 months. Cattle drives could be boring, yet very dangerous. 2 out of 3 cowboys never went on more than one drive. At the end of a drive, the herd was sold. The cattle could bring anywhere from $8 to $40 per steer. Cowboys were paid about $30 a month for 3 or 4 months' work, barely enough for a new hat and boots. Gallusses, wild rags, and mule ears. Cowboys rode horses, sometimes through thorny brush and tall weeds. They rode in heat, cold, rain, snow, and every kind of weather in between. Cowboys had to wear work clothes that were strong and long-lasting. Cowboys wore long johns, underwear with long arms and legs. Long johns were usually made of wool. They kept cowboys warm on cold winter nights. They also soaked up sweat, which rotted clothes quickly. Cowboys wore shirts and pants made of heavy wool, which lasts longer than lightweight wool. While working, cowboys usually did not wear belts. Some wore suspenders, which were also called galluses. Some cowboys tied cotton print bandanas around their neck. Bandanas, or wild rags, protected cowboys' necks from the hot sun. This helped stop sunstroke or sicknesses caused by overexposure to the sun. If untreated, sunstroke can cause a person to have a fever and eventually lose consciousness. Cowboys also used bandanas to wipe sweat from their foreheads. They tied wounds with them. Cowboys also covered their noses and mouth with bandanas to ward off trail dust. Cowboys thought of their hats as a way of identifying themselves to others. Hats were made from a mixture of wool and fur. This mixture made the hats long-lasting and strong. Sometimes cowboys used their hats as quirts or small whips. They used them to carry water or as pillows. Cowboys also used their hats to fan fires. Cowboys' hats had many styles, and cowboys wore them for good reasons. A hat's high crown or top kept a cowboy's head cool under the hot summer sun. Its wide rim kept the sun from his eyes and off his neck. In rain and snow, a hat was like a small umbrella. It also protected a cowboy's head from low tree branches. Cowboys often rode through brush that had thorns, which meant that their legs needed strong protection. Leather boots that went from the feet to the knee gave this protection. Boots were important to cowboys. They wanted handmade boots that fit their feet perfectly. Such custom-made boots could cost cowboys $50 a pair, but they were worth it. Some boots had narrow toes so that they could fit in a stirrup better. The heels of some boots were high and went from wide at the top to thin at the bottom. Sometimes cowboys on foot roped cattle. Boots with high, thin bottom heels dug into the ground easily, which helped the cowboys help keep their balance. Cowboys' boots had no laces or buckles. However, boots did not fall from a cowboy's feet because they fit tightly at the arch and against the heel. Because the boots fit tightly, cowboys stood to put them on. They stepped into the boot and pulled on its pull straps or mule ears. With experience, cowboys could put their boots on without hopping around or falling down. Cowboys had spurs on their boots, which they poked into their horses' sides to get them to run faster or turn quicker. Horses had thick matted hair. Spurs went through the hair and tapped the horse's skin. Spurs rarely hurt horses. Cowboys needed healthy horses, not injured ones. Cowboys needed to cover their legs with more than their boots and wool pants. Boots did not protect enough of the cowboys' legs, and wool pants ripped easily. For extra protection, cowboys wore leather chaps. Cowboys spent much time working with ropes and holding their horses' reins. They wore tough buckskins or tanned animal hide gloves to protect their hands. Everything cowboys wore was tough. Everything they wore had a purpose. Wood and wet rawhide. Cowboys could ride their horses 15 or more hours a day. They needed strong, comfortable, and useful saddles. After all, saddles carried the cowboys and all their tools. Cowboys bought saddles at a saddlery. Generally, a cowboy paid a month's wages for a saddle. This was a lot of money back then, but a good saddle could last 30 years. Saddles came in many different styles. However, wood served as each saddle's frame. Saddle makers used pine wood that was free of knots. They lacquered the frame several times to keep it from rotting. Next, saddle makers placed a wet leather or rawhide on the lacquered frame. When the leather dried, it kept the frame hard and stiff. Dressed leather was sewn over the rawhide to finish the saddle. Cowboys roped cattle and hook the rope around the saddle horn. To make the horns strong, saddle makers make them out of iron. The shape of a cowboy's saddle was important since it gave him some comfort. More importantly, the curved shape kept the cowboy in the saddle and on his horse. When cowboys roped cattle, their saddles needed to stay in place. The saddles had two girths, or straps, that were tied around the horse's body to secure the saddle. A square of leather or skirt spread out from the saddle. This skirt helped distribute weight on the horse and make the cowboy more stable in the saddle. The skirts also had leather rings. Tools were tied to the rings for easy access. A saddle had to have good stirrups, which cowboys used to rest their feet. Stirrups also helped cowboys get on their horses and stay on them. Cowboys jumped in and out of their saddles many times each day. Large stirrups made the jumping easier and faster. A cowboy with a poor saddle could fall to the ground and be hurt. A cowboy knew a good saddle was worth more than he paid for it. A good saddle made his work easier and safer. Cattle drives. Cattle owners wanted the best 4-year-old steers called beeves taken out on a drive because these steer brought the highest price at market. The herd also included cows that could be sold. 1- and 2-year-old calves were also taken on the drive to be fattened at the end of the trail before sale and sold to ranchers who were starting herds in the north. Calves that were born on the trail were killed. Young calves could not keep up with the herd on the trail. The Chisholm Trail was about 800 miles long. The Goodnight Loving Trail was over 1,000 miles long. Because of the long distances, cattle owners wanted only the best cowboys to drive their cattle. The best cowboys brought the most steer to market and kept the steer healthy, which meant the cattle owners made more money. Cattle owners hired about 10 cowboys for a drive. This many cowboys could handle about 2,500 cattle. Cowboys took few personal things on the drive. Usually they took a bedroll, a change of clothes, a slicker to wear in the rain, a knife, a pistol, and a rifle. Cattle owners supplied the horses for the drive. This herd of horses was called a remuda. On a typical drive, each cowboy needed about 8 horses. The cowboys rotated their horses on the drive so the horses would not get worn out. Cattle owners also hired a man to take care of the remuda. Cowboys called this man a horse wrangler. Generally, a horse wrangler cared for about 200 horses. Every cattle drive had a cook, sometimes called Cookie. He not only cooked, but also could cut hair, sewed clothes, and took care of injuries. He drove the chuck wagon, too. Charles Goodnight made the first chuck wagon by modifying a U.S. Army wagon. He added a few sets of drawers to hold flour, lard, coffee, and dried apples. He added a shelf at the wagon's rear that folded down so cooks could prepare food. A chuck wagon carried everything a cook needed. A trail drive also included one other man, the trail boss. He was in charge of the drive. He rode in front, leading the cowboys and cattle. Longhorns disliked moving from well-known land to unknown land. To keep them from getting too nervous and starting a stampede, cowboys moved the herd slowly. A good trail boss knew a herd moved better when it followed a lead steer. Some trail bosses used the same lead steer for several drives. The cowboys also had a leader. The trail boss rode ahead of the cowboys and the herd. He studied the trail, looking for water and grass for the cattle to eat. Only the most experienced cowboys rode in front of the herd. One rode on the right side, the other on the left. The other cowboys called these men the point riders. Less experienced cowboys rode on each side of the herd. These swing riders were about a third of the way back from the point riders. Other cowboys rode still farther back from the swing riders. Flank riders were about 2/3 of the way back from the point riders. The last experienced cowboy rode at the end of the herd, forcing lame, slow, or lazy cattle to keep up. Drag or tail riders had the worst place in the herd. A herd of 3,000 cattle stirred up a lot of dirt. The drag riders rode in this ever-present dust cloud. The herd of horses and chuck wagon followed a good distance behind the herd. The chuck wagon moved ahead of the herd at noon and at supper time. One eyewitness wrote that a herd he saw was close to 1 mile long and looked like a snake. He wrote that the herd moved about 12 miles that day. On the trail, the cook began the cattle drive's day. As sun rose, he awoke the cowboys. Some cooks yelled, "Grub pile." Grub pile was slang for a meal that was ready. A cowboy's usual breakfast was sourdough bread and coffee. After breakfast, the cowboys packed their bedrolls in the chuck wagon, then saddled their horses and rode off to round up the herd. At the herd, the point riders guided about 100 cattle away from the night's bed ground. Longhorns disliked moving from their overnight grazing and sleeping land. The point riders slowly and calmly moved them. Next, the swing riders gathered more cattle. They moved them as carefully as the point riders moved theirs. The flank riders gathered more of the herd. They also moved their cattle with care. Finally, the drag riders moved the last of the herd. In a short time, the lead steer and a few other steers moved to the head of the herd. In about an hour, the cattle were walking in a long line. They were calm and ready to walk the day's trek, usually about 10 miles. After a few days, the cattle became trail broke and weren't as nervous. Cowboys allowed a trail-broken herd to walk a while, stop, and graze for a time. While the herd ate, cowboys kept steer from straying too far from the herd. After the cattle grazed, the cowboys urged them to move again. At noon, the cowboys stopped the herd. The cook had moved the chuck wagon ahead and had the cowboys' noon meal ready and waiting. Cowboys usually ate sourdough bread, bacon, and beans. On the trail, meat rotted quickly, so good cooks were always searching for extra meat to feed their men. Occasionally, they killed one of the longhorns. However, cattle on the drive had tough meat, so cooks preferred prairie chicken, rabbit, or antelope for extra meat when they could get it. Cowboys favored a noon stop near water. The herd needed water at least once a day. A watering stop at noon gave the cowboys time to eat and relax, since they didn't need to watch the herd as carefully. Cowboys always let the longhorn drink as much water as they wanted. On a trail ride, one day was about the same as another. At dawn, the cowboys ate. They picked their horses from the remuda, saddled up, and rode to the herd. Then they slowly and calmly got the herd moving. At noon, they stopped for lunch and a change of horses. Then they moved the herd again until evening. The cowboys moved the herd about half a mile off the trail at sundown. The trail boss generally found a good place for the night ahead of time. Groups of cowboys took turns watching the herd during the night, working in 2-hour shifts. Cowboys hummed or sang to the herd bedded at night. Herds bedded down for about 5 hours each night. At about 4 o'clock in the next morning, the cowboys ate breakfast and began another day on the trail. Cow towns. In the spring of 1867, a man named Joseph McCoy traveled by train to Salina, Kansas. The train stopped in a tiny village while a bridge farther up the tracks was being repaired. The village, called Abilene, consisted of about 12 log huts, most of which had dirt roofs. Later, Joe McCoy went back to Abilene. He was looking for a place to ship cattle from. The land around Abilene was excellent pasture land. The Smoky Hill River was nearby. A United States Army post, Fort Riley, was also close. Best of all, a railroad went through town. McCoy bought 250 acres of land near town. On the land, he built a stockyard for 3,000 cattle. McCoy then sent a man south to Texas to tell cattle owners to drive their longhorns on the Chichome Trail to Abilene, Kansas. But Texas longhorns had small ticks on them. The ticks didn't hurt the longhorns, but they gave milk cows a fever that killed them. Kansas had passed a law in 1861 that banned longhorns from certain parts of Kansas. McCoy made a deal with the governor to get around this law. McCoy agreed to pay for any milk cows that died of the fever. Soon, McCoy had a booming cattle business in Abilene. By the end of 1867, the railroad shipped over 35,000 Texas Longhorns from Abilene to Chicago, Illinois. The next year, it shipped twice as many. 3 years later, it shipped 700,000 Longhorns to Chicago. Abilene was the first big cow town. In 3 years, it went from 12 log huts to a main street with 10 boarding houses, 4 hotels, 5 general stores, and 10 saloons. But Abilene did not stay a cow town for long. Abilene's citizens had made thousands of dollars from the cattle business, but the cowboys frightened them. After long cattle drives, cowboys were rowdy visitors. They overlooked laws and fought a lot. Because of the cowboys, the people of Abilene told the cattle owners to drive their cattle to another town. Other Kansas towns soon became cow towns. Ellsworth, Wichita, and Ellis served as shipping points for the cattle trade. Dodge City was the last famous Kansas cow town. Dodge City had once been a center for shipping the hides of the bison, often referred to as the buffalo back east. But hide prices had fallen, and Dodge City citizens needed another way to make money. They built stockyards and told Longhorn owners to drive their cattle to Dodge City. In 1877, over a quarter of the cattle shipped east on the Santa Fe Railroad came from Dodge City. But the era of great cattle trade was coming to an end. Settlers were moving to the prairie to claim homesteads and farm the land. The settlers used barbed wire to fence their property and keep cattle from destroying their crops. The Great Chisholm Trail was soon broken up by fenced fields. In 1877, Kansas passed a law that banned Texas cattle from the whole state in order to save milk cows from the tick fever. And eventually, railroads built lines into Texas, eliminating the need to drive the cattle north to the railroads in Kansas. By the end of the 1880s, the era of the cowboy had ended on the frontier. Cowboys of the Frontier.